then I will begin. This resolution advocates for the creation of savior siblings. So, what this means is two things for the framing of the round as opening government. First, we believe that this round is focusing solely on whether or not these siblings ought to be created, which means that if this savior sibling is 10 or 12, say, and wants to stop donating their bone marrow or not have an organ transplant, we believe they should have the autonomy to say no. Why is this true? Because this resolution only focuses on the creation of these savior siblings, not what's happening later on down the road. We believe that these children should have autonomy when they're able to voice their own opinions and speak for themselves, and we think that it's extremely important that that be taken under account. The second thing for framing, we think that these savior siblings should be used insofar as their life is not directly put in danger, insofar as these actions will not result in their death. This is because what was presented to us in the motion is that this is only focusing on organ transplants or cell donations, and we don't think that this directly harms life. I'll take your point.
With the context that savior siblings are created for fatal diseases, how can you justify waiting 10 or 15 years?
So we're not saying, what we're saying is that sure, they may be used to help the sibling in the first couple years, but we also think that these fatal diseases sometimes come back later, and it may be necessary that these savior siblings be used 10, 12 years down the road, and we say at that point they should have the autonomy to say no. Now, the most important thing in today's round is how we can protect life and minimize suffering. We hold these two values to be extremely important, and it is because we stand in support of those values that we are so very proud to propose today's motion. Now, on to our first point, which is on principle, we believe that we ought to look to outcome. Why is this true? This is because we believe that outcomes allow a society to thrive. It's better to look, for example, to see how many people are living on a hole in society than just like what's coming on in between. Let's look at a very specific example, right? We all have kids, we all force kids to get certain types of vaccines as a kid. I can say personally, I did not want to be vaccinated. It hurt, and that was a small violation of my liberty because I was 2, 3, and I didn't want to get a vaccine. But in the long run, that was better for society because we're protecting more people. We say that we ought to look to these outcomes on principle because it is in that way that we actually allow a society to thrive. When you look to means in and of themselves, it prevents you from looking to the larger picture, and we think that that's going to be a critical flaw in team opposition because they're not going to be looking at the larger picture at hand. As a society, we think we should look to ends insofar as rights or life is not violated in the meantime. This means that we believe that since savior children are created to save lives as a whole, insofar as their lives are not violated, we should be looking at the outcomes of those actions and propose today's resolution. No, thank you. Let's go on to our second point, which is that we believe that savior siblings are sometimes the only way, and on whole, the best way to actually save lives. Why is this true? Let's start by providing some context. Oftentimes in these fatal diseases, these kids are on a waiting list for years or months at a time. And oftentimes, this time is not really pleasant for these kids at all. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of suffering, a lot of pain, trying to find an exact match. It's no secret that these matches are extremely difficult to find, and in the meantime, when these kids are sitting in the hospital waiting to find their perfect match for a kidney transplant, they're actually eating up their parents' money, and that actually puts significant strain on the parents in and of themselves. So what we think is that in this time, sometimes a child may die waiting to find a perfect match, and sometimes what happens is that these children are suffering in the long term. So the only solution sometimes, when there is no better option, is to actually use these savior siblings so that these people can find a match and actually save their lives. Sure, I'll take your point.
How would you compare the prices between the waiting time that they would have to wait on the list and the price that it would cost for a parent to have another child?
So we think that the waiting time on the list would actually cost more money because when you're on the list, sometimes these children have to stay in the hospital for the long term, for months and years at a time. And remember, in this time, because it's a fatal disease, oftentimes it's going to be intensive care. So we think that's going to cost a lot more money than the cost it would have to have one savior sibling, especially in the long term when sometimes you can't even solve these diseases with a simple cell transplant. So what we're telling you is that these savior children are sometimes the only way to actually save these lives and solve this problem. So, what are the impacts? We think two things. First, when you have these savior children, you're going to be able to save the lives of these people in the short term and in the long term, because down the road we think that these treatments are going to actually be better because savior siblings actually have the same genes and the same genetic material as their siblings. So we think that these organ transplants are going to work better. It's going to be a lesser chance for this rejection of a heart transplant or an organ transplant or a cell rejection in general. The second thing that we think is going to happen is that you're going to minimize suffering of these children and of the parents, because these children are not going to have to spend time waiting in a hospital for an extensive period of time in pain because they don't have a way to get out of their disease or to be cured. And similarly, parents will not have to deal with the emotional trauma of actually having to leave their jobs maybe to stay with their child, or having to deal with their child being sick and suffering in the hospital. And then the third impact is that in the long term, you're actually going to save money for these parents because they're not going to have their children in intensive care or in these hospitals for extensive period of time. And the other thing that we think is going to happen is that these parents are not going to have to deal with the ethical dilemma if this child is not getting a match and if this child is extremely suffering of whether or not they actually want to pull the plug. I think we can all agree that no parent is going to want to deal with that kind of decision, so in order to save them that sort of suffering, we think that savior siblings should actually be allowed. Now, something that team opposition may bring up is that this savior child has no choice in whatever actually happens to them. But we believe that since the savior child is not actually being killed in this process, in the long term, what's going to happen is that both children are going to be happy, because the one child that had a fatal disease is going to be cured, and the other child is also going to be living a happy, healthy life. We think that we are saving two lives here, whereas team opposition is not really going to be providing a good way for the one child to actually survive in the long term without having to deal with all of the costs of trauma that we provide. So what we show you is that, first of all, we are winning on principle because we're looking at outcomes, and second of all, we're winning practically as well because we're showing you how we're saving all of these costs and protecting life and minimizing suffering. It is for those reasons that we are so very proud to propose. Thank you.
Thank you, Speaker, for works. Now call upon the Leader of Opposition.
Is everyone ready? I think it's quite funny that PM comes up here and says that they want to protect outcomes and they care about society, but they're doing this by detrimenting the lives of children and disregarding the autonomy. We think this is a disgusting policy, and we're going to give you reasons why that is. So, first, rebuttal, then we'll get into our case, which is 1. 2 points broadly why you disregard the autonomy of this child at birth and throughout your life. Secondly, why the sibling that you save, the life of that person is going to be worse. Third, why you make medicine as a whole and research worse on your side. So firstly, few bits of rebuttal. So the first thing that they wanted to say was that this is the only way to do that. Here's our counterprop. What we suggest, we prefer to do, is to have an opt-out system for organ donation. So that means you have a much larger pool of organs, and we already see this working in Scandinavian countries, for example. It's a more effective policy. So on our side, given this, you're more likely to have organs in that world. Second thing that they wanted to talk about is how parents are going to have emotional trauma because their kid is suffering, right? 2 things. Number 1, I think as a parent, when you birth a child specifically for the purpose of robbing them of their organs, you're going to have to deal with that emotional trauma, and that's going to be a problem that parents have to deal with on your side. And secondly, it's really muddy in their case because I don't know what kind of diseases we're talking about, because if these are long-term diseases where your children are constantly in the hospital and you're just subsisting them, then these parents are still going to feel bad that these children are doing horribly in that case. The rest of my rebuttal is going to be integrated. First, why you disregard the autonomy of this child? First point, the consent of children and why this is problematic. So first of all, in society when children are born, they're born through the birth lottery and they don't have the consent of that. But why are we okay with this on our side compared to their side? So I think the good thing on our side is that even though you don't consent to being born, you're still loved by your parents. There's a biological connection that keeps you together, and that's what is fine with your life, right? The problem with their side is that you don't have this love between the parent and the child anymore, because you're only birth, the purpose of your life is to support support someone else. And we think that's harmful for like the state of these children, and like they're not going to have the same quality of life as the other child that is getting saved. And they also know that like the only reason they were there is to support like the other person, and they're not as important. Secondly, you rob these people of their body. So I think like these children, even though they don't have the ability to consent, have ownership over their body and their organs, and you rob these people of that. They have to prove why, like, if you want to like defend society and people as a whole, why stealing things from these children is a justified means of like achieving like better outcome. Thirdly, and more importantly, like it's not these children's fault, right? Like these savior siblings have like no relation to like the disease that has happened. I don't see why they have to pay for the problems that have happened. I think if anything, we would prefer like even in a world where you cannot get the organs, where like parents, for example, donate these organs. I think that's a more preferable outcome instead of like birthing children for this. Secondly, why why you harm the future ends of these children? So I think like in general, using people as a means to an end is an unjust thing. But we're going to view why like practically this is harmful for the lives of these children, right? So I think these savior siblings, much like any other child that is born, has goals and aspirations that they want to achieve, the point at which they have like some ability to like conceptualize what their life wants to look like, right? And when you use these people as like an organ bank, and like you're just robbing them of their body and their ability to do things, you make it harder for these people to achieve these ends. What does this look like? For example, if you want to be an athlete and if you want to like run track, for example, it's less likely that you're going to be able to do this. If you want to be an academician, if you want to be like an academic, like it's less likely that you're going to have like the mental, like you're probably going to be like mentally drained from like all the blood that's being drawn out of your body. It's going to be harder for you to study. And then secondly, like we reject the case where like these children don't die, because I think some of like these harmful diseases require like vital organs like the heart or the liver for you to be taken out. So like in those cases, like these children get killed in this instance. But even if like that's not an outcome, like everything else still stands. Third, why the life of like the sibling that you save is necessarily going to be worse given this policy. So I think when you know that your existence is based on the suffering of someone else directly, this is a much more like harder life to live with, and it's going to be harder for you to live with yourself mentally, right? So you know that like the only reason you are subsisting is because someone else is being like the blood is being drawn out of these people, or like they are going to be used to like make sure you survive. It's going to be harder for you to live with yourself. So you're going to be filled with like a life of regret, that like why does this person have to suffer for me to live? You're not going to be in like a comfortable mental state. And if your goal is to protect the life of this individual, they're not going to be happy, right? Because they're constantly feeling like the reason why they're alive is because someone else is suffering, and that means the mental state of this person is going to be worse. They're not going to be happy, and they're not going to be able to like achieve like happiness in life, which I think is like the ultimate goal in this debate. And when you compromise the happiness of the individual that you're trying to save, I don't think there's value in this policy. Closing up, thank you.
Yeah, why are you valuing the happiness of the savior sibling over the happiness of the child with like a deadly disease, or the happiness of the parents who are going to lose a child in the alternative world?
Because like these savior siblings didn't consent to any of this, right? Like it's far more problematic when you're robbing these people of like the ability to like live a healthy life compared to like a savior, compared to someone with a disease they had nothing to do with. Lastly, like why medicine gets better on our side, or at least like why this side is worse. So I think on our side, at least you have some incentive to find like cures or like research for these diseases that are fatal to people. Why is it worse on the other side? Because now, when these people or when these children suffer from these diseases, it's more likely that people are going to recommend for you to say, oh, why don't you just birth a savior child to solve this problem? So the problem with that is twofold. Number one, you're going to have less organ donations or less like transplants, because people feel like they just birth a child in order to do this. So your organ market is necessarily going to be smaller, and this problem is just going to get worse and worse. Secondly, research for these particular types of diseases is going to be less on their side of the house, because necessarily like when you have like some means of dealing with this problem, it's less likely that you're going to deal with those or like find a cure for those diseases when there are other diseases like cancer, for example, which can devote more resources to, and like for those like reasons, you're not going to get research on this side. On our side, we're going to get more donations and you're going to get more research from these cures, because like we can see the suffering of these individuals and we sympathize with them and we want to make their life better, but you don't have to do it in a way that like harms the bodily autonomy of these people. What government has to defend in this debate is literally robbing children of their organs and their consent, and like robbing them of the ability to achieve anything with their lives in order to save people who have problems that they have nothing to do with. We're very proud to propose.
opposition, I may call upon the Deputy Prime Minister.
Ready? What we just heard out of side opposition was a counterclaim that completely undermined almost every single point made in their own case, a lot of non-responsive statements made to our own principled arguments, as well as the second contention brought up by our Prime Minister. So what I want to do during this is first I'll just go through, clear up a couple of things about what this round is really about, also discuss why they completely contradict themselves on their side, all of their moral standings really fall, and then we want to go through and explain our different paths to victory. So first, let's talk about what they start in the beginning. They said parents will have to deal with the ethical dilemma of stealing organs from a child, and we don't want to put them through that. First of all, this resolution states this House would allow this process to happen. So this means the parents have already gone through that moral dilemma. This is not relevant in this debate. So then they bring up this whole entire point about organ donation being an opt-out system like the Scandinavian system. Well, first of all, they ignore every single point that we bring up on our side about how siblings are more likely to be organ matches for someone in the family, and therefore less likely to be, the organs are less likely to be rejected. So there's a higher rate of success on our side if these children end up choosing to donate to their siblings. But also, so then they bring up a lot of points in the rest of the constructive, saying, first of all, so their last point in this speech was about how there's going to be no incentive to look for cures if we have these people as savior siblings, they'll just donate all the organs. But with their opt-out organ donation system, pretty much we can say on their side of the house that all these people get organs anyways on their model, and therefore there's no incentive to look for cures. So on both sides of the house, if that's the argument that you're going to buy into, then people get organs on both sides, there's no incentive for cures on both sides. But we say that actually on our side, that's not what's going to happen. Their logic just goes against themselves. We say that on our side, people still advocate for cures for diseases because they see people suffering for the time that they get, the time that they have to suffer before actually getting the organs. We also say that on our side of the house, there are more survivors of these diseases because their savior siblings are able to donate to them, and therefore they are survivors. They advocate saying, I survived through this, I survived through this pain, you really should go out, donate to this cause, and make sure that we're able to cure this in the long run. And because of this, if they really argue that savior siblings are such a bad thing, we are able to not have these people go through suffering for that long on our side of the house, and therefore we win on this impact. You seem to disagree.
A point of inconsistency between you and your partner. Are we taking these organs from the children once they have the opportunity to consent at an older age, or when they're young?
Oh, yeah, so that's my next point. I'm going to address a couple more contradictions in their case, and then get into the whole conflict on autonomy. So first, let's talk about how they say it's unjust to use people as a means to an end. Yet they advocate for a system that increases organ donation. They say this just makes you view people as an organ bank. If you have like your sibling who can donate all your organs. Yet they advocate for using more people as organ banks. So once again, this is a complete contradiction on their side. All of their deontology arguments actually don't make any sense because they're arguing for something that also has an ends-focused model. So then they talk about how if you think that your self-survival is based on other people's suffering, you're never going to be truly happy. Yet that's what happens with organ donation. That's what happens with blood donation. That's what happens with bone marrow donation. Every single thing that they advocate on their side of the house is actually going against all the principles they claim to stand for. No, I'm not taking any more POS. So then let's go into this entire autonomy point. So as my partner said, we said that it is just to allow these siblings to come into existence, to be created for this main purpose. So we said that once these people are created, it's ethical to have this is ethical as an action in and of itself. But therefore, once we get to that point where children are able to have autonomy, we say we are going to give them the choice because we don't want to force them to do anything. What you're getting uniquely on our side of the house is the opportunity for these people to be cured of diseases. No more POIs during the speech, as I said. So, what I want to do now is just explain our paths to victory. Oh, actually, no, I want to refute some more things on their side of the house. So also, they say that on our side of the house, there's no love between parent and child. We say this is completely false. If you see this person as saving the life of someone that you really love, if they choose to do so, then there's going to be more love between the parent and the child because they're adding more happiness to their life. Also, we are going to talk about how, once again, we put in the choice and the model that's going to be a choice. If they're not going to be seen as that's their only purpose. No parent is just going to want to have a child for its only purpose if they don't want a child in the first place. So we say on our model that this is not going to happen. But also, we say that when they say we are compromising happiness of life, once again, no more POIs, we say that we're at least providing life on our side of the house. We are increasing the happiness of the family as a whole. Because why? If you're a savior sibling, you are going to feel really, really good about, first of all, if you choose to help your siblings, then you're going to be happier because you are providing life to someone that you genuinely care about, that you have that bond to. You're going to say that your parents are happy because you are in their life, that your sibling is in their life, and they both don't have to watch their child die. So you're going to have that happiness in your life if you choose to follow this path as a savior sibling. So, what do we want to talk about now? We want to talk about different paths to victory. First of all, they never really engage with us on principle except to completely contradict themselves with all these things about people as a means to an end, and all these things about your life relying on others' suffering. First of all, their entire point about how we must inherently be killing these children in order to save lives. We say, no, that doesn't fall within the purview of this debate per our model, and they can't really contest that. So that, the principled outcomes that we still have. We say that we are better because we are protecting more people, and the means in and of itself leads to a bigger picture. We are making sure that more people are surviving in society. We are providing more happiness, more life on our side of the house, which they have failed to recognize. So, then even if you say that these children don't have autonomy on our side of the house, first of all, look at this. Parents already have control over medical decisions, and we don't really contest that. Unless they want to say that every single person should be able to make their own medical decisions about their body, then they're completely contradicting their case in this sense. So then, we want to also talk about all the points that we brought up about how savior siblings are the only option. So, as we brought up, in a lot of cases, these are the only people who are able to provide matches for organ donation because otherwise it's going to be very likely to be rejected. So at least in this situation, we are giving a chance that these people can have these organs. We've proven all the harms on their side of the house to either be contradictory or false. So that we also bring up that these people, there's one point that was really not addressed on side opposition, which is also this for cell transplants as well. Cell transplants, if you can't really get those from anybody else unless they have almost identical DNA to you. So we're saying that this is really the only option that you don't get out of an organ opt-in system on their side of the house. So we are saying that this is a unique option that we are providing, and therefore it is ethical in and of itself to allow the creation of these children. So, what do we win on? We win on principle because we talk about why all these actions are morally just. We also talk about utilitarianism. We are saying that we are providing all these things to people. We are also saying that we are minimizing children's suffering, which we think is incredibly important, and we value in this debate. This is providing the only option that can end the people who are spending their lives in hospital beds. This is ending the forced ethical dilemma of whether or not the parents have to pull a plug on their own child because they don't see any other option. This is the only way to make sure that this is an actual viable path for these people. So we are very proud to propose.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister, and call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Opening government in this debate round today really only seems to want to talk about a single moment in time. But because we don't think that the consequences of this lifelong decision all go away right after the creation, we are proud to oppose this motion today. In this speech, a few things. First, I'll be going over a couple of key issues in their case. First, on this idea of autonomy, then moving into their flawed conception of parents. Finally, on this brief point they make about cell transplants in like the last 15 seconds of their speech. Second, I'll be clarifying this counter model, and finally, I'll be moving into some questions, doing some weighing and framing on the way, talking about both the life of the sibling they value so much, and then talking about what we also think is important, which is the life of that savior child. But first, some clarifications on this means to an end misunderstanding in their last speech. So their counter examples here is like, we also have a means to an end ideology, right? Because like, people can donate blood and bone marrow, right? The problem here is that this savior child solely exists as a means to an end. They are solely a means in this world where someone who chooses to donate blood has other things they can do with their lives. Like, this is distinctly different, and we don't think that they can equate these two things in their world. So now let's move into some major flaws in their case. First, they bring you this idea of autonomy. First off, we would tell you there's no precedent for like a child who's like not being like directly abused, right? For like freeing themselves from their parents and having this kind of autonomy, right? And we would also tell you that they can never recover full autonomy when they've already had their organs taken away. We would tell you that they lose a certain degree of quality of life, first because they just don't have these organs, and second, they've lost both time in education, socializing, etc. because of like these procedures they've had to go through, right? We're telling you that they can never regain full autonomy, especially at the point at which like a lot of their life choices have been stripped away from them already, and they fail to engage with like this analysis that like that first stripping away of autonomy is like harmful in and of itself. But now let's go into this misconception of like what the parents go through. They tell us, oh, the motion says that like they've already agreed to the creation, so they're fine with it. We find this highly problematic because we tell you when we make such a decision like this that like you deal with that dilemma every single day of your life. You look at your child and like, I know that you're only here because I had another child to save you. I know that you only exist in this world to save my other child. You go through that dilemma every day. They can't just say, oh, we separate it from the moment that we make that decision. That doesn't happen. Okay, so now let's move on to this idea that they save more lives, right? First off, we would tell you that there are ways to save these lives in the status quo, and I'm going to be moving into our counter model soon. And second, we would tell you that you should value the quality of a life over the quantity of lives in the world, and we would tell you that because they like cause major detriments to that, they're not going to be winning this round. Now finally, just like briefly addressing the cell transplant thing, we would tell you that like a parent can also provide this, and second off, a lot of their argumentation relies on the fact that like an identical twin would be produced, which is just like not how it works. And so like keep in mind that almost all of their impacts rest on that kind of efficiency. So now let's move into this counter model that Amar provides you. So we would tell you that like the reason that this opt-out system is highly important is the fact that like it's already effective in a lot of Scandinavian countries. So first off, we have like proved like more efficiency here, and second off, we tell you that institutional failures should not become the burden of the family. Like we tell you that there should be like internal reform here, and they're not addressing the root cause of the issue because again, Amar provides you some excellent analysis here as to why people become more apathetic because now your solution is just create another child as opposed to like confronting the problems that exist in the status quo. But now let's move into some major weighing questions in this round today. What does the life of the sibling that has been saved look like? Because we do agree with them that this is a life that's important, but we do not believe that a savior sibling is the only mechanism to help them and to save them, and we tell you that because you should also evaluate the psychological effects on this child because there are other ways to save them, right? You'll see that this child is going to deal with the entire life, the poor quality of life of their sibling that has propped up their own life. And also the idea that this child did not have the autonomy to make this decision. The parent made it for them, but they have to deal with that the consequences are all made to save them. And they have to deal with that for the rest of their lives. You have to evaluate the psychological effects on this child, the fact that they're never going to be able to do anything without thinking about the fact that, oh, this is because my sibling is living in a poor quality. So now let's move on to the savior child, which I really don't think opening government does a great job of addressing. And so, well, they're fine. They say, oh, at some point in their lives we'll give them autonomy. Like, at some point that's going to happen. We tell you this is problematic for a couple of reasons. First, this initial violation is problematic in and of itself. And we tell you, I already gave you analysis as to why they can never regain full autonomy because of that. But now let's look at what happens because they bring up when they're 11 or 12, they can make this choice, right? First off, I want to look at just what this choice actually looks like. They say the child can just say, no, I'm not going to give my organs to my sibling anymore. But is that decision really that easy? We would tell you, how does the family accept this? Does the sibling, you've been supporting this, you're the only reason that your sibling is alive. Is it really that easy to just say, no, I can't do this anymore? Because yes, you're physically harming yourself, but is that still enough for you to be able to tell them that you are just I can't do this anymore? So we would tell you that what's far more likely is that the child is just going to continue saying yes, but for the wrong reasons. And before I go into that, I'll take back half. Okay, no, thanks. Okay, so what we're saying is that they're more likely going to say yes, but for the wrong reasons. And so what we see is that even in a world where they allow for the autonomy of this child, they never have the ability to gain this because the choice is so difficult to make. So what ends up happening is that they commit the rest of their lives to their sibling. They never become an individual themselves because they can't move away, because they always have to be there for any kind of procedure that their sibling is going to need. They never have this ability, and because we think that you should protect the value of a life and not just how many you can create, that we are so proud to oppose this motion today.
All right, thank Deputy Leader of Opposition upon the member of government. Sure.
Okay, Hannah. Front half argued the general ethics of the proposal. On CO exclusively, we're going to prove why minorities are disproportionately fucked by the medical system currently, and how we actually fix this with our proposal on side yard. Okay. 4 things. First, Excellus Rebuttal, then 2 explanations, and then some world building, and then finally our unique point about why we're uniquely helping minorities. Okay, let's begin. So we got 4 arguments out of front half here. The first argument being that how there's quality over quantity, and like they prefer that world. We'd say like it's very hard to quantify this because parents' lives are important and children's life is important too. We think it's kind of a wash. Like you can't really, like it's not fair to say one life is more important than the other. So like they need to explain that better. I'm sorry, but they can't. Okay, move on. Opt out. So their second point about opt out. So opt out only works when on like dead people, or on the dead. Even if there's an increase in organ donation, it doesn't actually solve things like blood or stem cells you need to be alive for. So we think that case closed. Okay, you're welcome. Okay. Third point, long-term impacts. We think that people can opt, their point about the long-term impacts, we think that people can opt out later in life, which is making it okay, which leads to a decrease in shame and an increase of support systems in society, and my partner's going to impact this in his whip. And then finally, the point about children saying no, or how the child says no to this, or if they can say no. Again, my partner's going to cover this in his whip, and I'm also going to cover it implicitly in my extension. Okay, on to world building. So, on to my explanations. We have 2 explanations. First, what we're going to do is we're going to explain who is impacted by this, and then we're going to explain why we actually help the most vulnerable minorities. Okay, moving on to world building. Understand that in Canada, there's a huge push for stem cell donors of color. Therefore, we think that it's distinctly difficult to make, for minorities to make genetic matches, which is what we're going to prove to you today, and why minorities specifically are more important under the system. Why? Because simply there are less couples that are mixed race or minorities in general who are offering these sort of stem cell donations. I.e. like an Asian black couple making a mixed child, or an Indian and white couple making a mixed child, right? We think that there are very few people that they can address on their side of the house that actually can deal with the genetic problem that they bring. Therefore, this is a very key minority that we can impact. Furthermore, we think that these kinds of people are actually inaccessible because of their lower socioeconomic status. Therefore, insofar as parents who have the specific genetic markers exist in the world, and we do think there are people like this in the world, in the absence of good alternatives, because we really haven't heard any from their side, we think that 1, savior siblings are uniquely the best option, and 2, parents have distinct moral obligations for the parents to have. Understand that no one's forcing anyone. We're just providing a viable alternative to minority and mixed parents because the medical system uniquely doesn't cater to their needs. Okay. Understand they're the alternative world, right? On their side. Children of minorities are more likely to be dying from diseases because of this lack of donors and mixed donors, okay? And then second, wealthy people can afford it disproportionately, which we don't think is fair, sure.
But isn't it also true that in a lot of poor countries, there are more children who don't have parents, and we don't know exactly who their parents are, and they could be hurt by a system that emphasizes these new organ donors?
Okay. 2 responses to that. 1 is going to be in my comparative, my future comparative. But the first thing is in Western liberal democracies, that doesn't occur, and we're catering to mixed couples who don't have the accessible resources already because of the things impacts I've already outlined in my world building. Okay, let's move on. On to my main constructive about how our solution distinctly helps minorities. 2 main impacts. I've already given you the mechanism in my but like 2 main impacts. One, people can't find matches, which means there are dead children in like mixed couples. We think that's pretty self-explanatory. If you can't find matches genetically, they're going to end up dead because they're like inhibiting diseases. And secondly, we're granting moral autonomy to groups of people historically fucked by the lack of the choices that they get in the current medical system. Okay, understand another comparative, that there are literally no alternatives for minorities under their system. There are technological impacts to this, and I think this directly clashes with what we've heard from OO, and we're going to hear more from CO. Like this idea of by allowing people to act now instead of waiting for expensive and time-consuming technology, and furthermore, save your siblings uniquely allow the parents in these medical decisions, autonomy in these medical decisions that they don't really have autonomy in currently. And furthermore, I think this leads directly into racial impacts and how parents of mixed race alone are not suitable candidates, right? We heard this from their side to us. They don't have the same genetic composition of the first child they bear, and only the second child that they bear, because they're uniquely mixed or uniquely of a certain ethnicity, they have to. Siblings are uniquely useful for this. That key point there, they can't really touch that because that's the only impact that we get on our side of the house. We think that point proves our weighing in the case, in which if we can prove that the needs of these minorities in general outweigh the alternative they give us, we think we take it. I'll take back up.
What's your justification for limiting it to the minorities and not the entire population of society?
Well, we aren't limiting only limiting it to minorities. We're saying that minorities are disproportionately impacted in a positive way if we give this to them because they don't really have good alternatives in the healthcare system. Okay, so why is this all important, right? I already talked about this. Because our current system doesn't really work for minorities who can't access viable alternatives because of their uniquely genetic composition, and we think that this in the world looks like currently, racial tension in the healthcare system, which furthermore looks like children of minorities and mixed couples dying a lot more often than children of white couples. Are we okay with mixed children dying more often than white children? I don't think so. That's the moral standpoint we take today. We stand with minorities. We are so proud to propose today. Thank you so much.
I'd like to thank the speaker and call upon the Leader of Opposition.
I think one point that really hasn't been addressed much in this round is what this really means in terms of what kind of worldview a country who's adopting the system is going to actually embrace. That's something that I really want to hit home here. What kind of country that adopts a policy where this is allowed, what are they actually valuing here? And that's something I'm going to address in my points. But first of all, I want to look a little bit at the framework and just clarify a few things. So, in response to a lot of things that opening government said, they talked about how they're simply allowing this process to happen. And I'd like to point out that if you're allowing a process to happen that allows you save your siblings, then you're basically encouraging it and you're not deterring it from happening. So it means it's going to happen more often. So they can't just basically cop out of all of the arguments by saying we're just allowing it and it's not like we're actually endorsing it or something like that. It seemed kind of like that's what they were arguing. Also, I'd like to note that nobody has ever really clarified when exactly we're allowing this. And so for all we know, we're basically allowing this in any situation, including situations where it would result in the death of a savior sibling. They seem to argue that this is just a non-argument, like we just shouldn't consider these cases, but these are very significant. Not at this time. Now, but even aside from that, you're going to see that actually we're going to have a worse world at the end of the day, even if you accept that it's not going to happen in those cases. Also, the alternative that the government team, the opening government team proposed, while it's not perfect, it does solve for a lot of the problems that the government team has talked about, and ultimately the alternative that they're proposing is going to make things a lot worse. Not at this time. Now, first of all, I want to do a couple points of rebuttal before I get to my more substantive arguments. Now, a lot of actually both sides, or both opening and closing government, have argued that we should have basically the system that allows people to opt out later, and by that we're giving people autonomy. So after they're old enough to make decisions, they can opt out. The problem is they've already lost their autonomy by this point, because they've already been forced to to donate organs against their will. Yes.
So when kids are first born, do they have the autonomy or like the choice to have a vaccine or not a vaccine in the status quo?
I am so glad you brought that up. The vaccine argument is really completely inapplicable, because no, they don't have the choice to decide whether they get a vaccine, but the vaccine is there to help them. It's not there so that we can steal something from them and give it to somebody else. So this is just one of the worst analogies brought up in this entire debate. Now I'd like to move on to the next argument. They talked about how basically this is going to disproportionately affect minorities. This is something that the other government team brought up. And I'd like to note that there's nothing particularly in the status quo in terms of the current medical research that's going on that's going to particularly harm minorities any more than anyone else. And as you're going to see from my constructive points, this is ultimately actually going to hurt minorities, not this time, because it's going to actually create more inequity and inequality. So I want to move on to a couple of constructive points, and I'll keep on rebutting points as I go. So the first point I want to make is that this system is simply philosophically bad, and it can basically spiral out of control and lead to a much worse system like the system we have in China. Now think about the philosophy behind saying that we can just take organs from somebody, violate that person's autonomy, and give them to somebody else against their will. Think about that philosophy. How is that any different from the philosophy that the Chinese government uses when they basically steal organs from prisoners and give them to other people? Yes, how is it different?
Well, okay, you keep comparing this model, but the reality is on our side, we're saving lives that you're not willing to save.
Look, I think we should save lives, and I think we should do whatever we can in order to progress medically in order to save lives, but not at the expense of violating somebody's freedom and stealing their organs from them. This is something that Western societies simply agree almost unanimously on, and yet for some reason we want to go into this alternative worldview where it's just okay to completely undermine people's autonomy. Yes?
Okay, so what do you do when there is simply no other option to save this child's life? Do you just say that these parents should let their kids die?
Well, I think that there should be more options, and actually what you're going to see is that if you actually encourage this, there are going to be fewer options for a lot of minorities. And this actually brings me to my second constructive point, which is that this plan of action actually hurts minorities significantly. Now, how does it do this? I want to harken back to one of the arguments that the opening opposition team made. It was a really powerful argument, and what they said is that if we rely more and more on these savior siblings, what that's going to do is it's going to give people less of an incentive to innovate and to try and find different medical cures that don't rely on savior siblings. It's going to discourage medical innovation. Now, who is this going to hurt disproportionately? The people it's going to hurt are the people who don't have access to savior siblings. In a lot of cases, poorer people, for instance, people in poor areas who are orphans. There's a lot more orphans in minority communities because a lot of times they don't have their parents die, or we don't know who their parents are. And these are the people who are going to be hurt disproportionately by a plan of action that emphasizes savior siblings, because they don't have access to savior siblings. So instead of medically innovating in a way that would help everybody, including these minorities, instead we're going with a plan of action that's actually only going to benefit people who have access to savior siblings, which most minorities don't. Now, I want to really look at some weighing here at the end of the day and see. Oh, well, actually, I'll take one last question.
Okay, so on that presumption, can you please clash why our side of how we help minorities with what you just said?
All right, well, I believe that our side helps minorities more, because what we're doing is we're not discouraging medical innovation, which is going to help everybody, including minorities. Instead of endorsing a system that's only going to only help people who actually have access to savior siblings, which is not everybody. And so, in terms of that, our plan is actually going to help more people. And I also like to point out that the alternative that the opening government pointed out actually avoids this problem, because it focuses on finding donors more generally and not necessarily needing parents, needing to know who their parents are before we're able to do the donation. So at the end of the day, what do you get with each team? All you get with the government plan is not only you do all the things that opening government said, you completely restrict the autonomy of these people, it's philosophically immoral, and on top of that, you're basically promoting this idea that it's okay for a child to live their entire lives knowing they only existed because their parents wanted to save another sibling. Not only do you get all of that, but you're also going to actually be hurting minorities at the end of the day. And so unequivocally, we should oppose this disastrous resolution. Thank you.
Thank you, Speaker. And I now want to call upon the government rep.
Alright, I'm going to begin with some refutation and then get back into some of the main themes of the round. Now, the first thing we see from side closing is that they talk about how allowing this to happen is somewhat equivalent to encouraging it to happen. And fundamentally, what we believe is that this isn't necessarily true. What we are going to tell you on side closing is that while this is allowing it, it doesn't necessarily need to encourage it because the choice ultimately lies with the parents. We believe fundamentally that this is still a very difficult moral decision for parents to make, and fundamentally our burden on side government is to prove that parents are morally justified in having a savior sibling, and that this is something they are allowed to do. What we believe is that allowing does not equal encouraging because we are merely providing people with another option. This isn't the only option, this is just something they can do as a last resort. Additionally, what we're talking about is they were criticizing this opt-out later approach where people can opt out later in life even if they were born to be a savior sibling. First off, what we're going to say is that the opt-out later approach is something that's happening in the status quo. Children are already having their autonomy violated until some point, until they become old enough to make their own educated decisions, and we believe that that isn't something that's unique to a world in which there aren't savior siblings. Additionally, what this allows is for a concrete framework to be provided by which children who are born as savior siblings to opt out of this later in life. In the status quo, if a parent or a couple has a child that just coincidentally happens to be a donation match for their sick kid, there's not really necessarily a moral framework that exists to say at what age can they say no. By allowing for people to have savior siblings, what we're doing is we're providing a more concrete moral framework by which these children can be supported and by which these children and parents have a concrete set of morals and laws to work within, rather than individual and sometimes clashing court decisions which exist in the status quo. Finally, they talk about how medical research is equal and it creates a more equitable world, but we fundamentally disagree with this point. Medical research exists, but first off, it's very slow. It can take 10 to 20 years for substantial development to come along, by which point the child has long since died. And additionally, when new technology does come out, the children, it's not an affordable option, which disproportionately affects poor people and minorities because they can't afford this new technology and they don't have any other options to save their child. Fundamentally, what we believe the most important actor here, in addition to the child, is the parents, and they're morally justified in doing whatever they can to save their children, and we believe that that's very important. But Backpack disagrees.
Yes, but why can't we use programs like Medicaid in order to give these newfound medical cures to dying children? I mean, this is one of the main
Okay,
where
so
Medicaid
while what we
goes
have the problem here is that Medicaid and most insurance companies don't always cover expensive and experimental technologies. If you look towards like many experimental tests, they're not covered by insurance, and many things that cost a lot of money also aren't covered. What we're doing is we're providing a faster way for parents to save their children now, rather than waiting until later with this technology that may or may not be developed. Now, finally, what we have to do is talk about what Backpack brought originally, and one of their points was something about having fewer options. Fundamentally, we on side government are not removing options, we are giving people options. Nowhere on our side does it say that no, there's no more technological development, because there's still going to be people who don't have siblings who have these issues. We are merely providing another option that doesn't necessarily exclude having technological development. And finally, this discouraging innovation is another point. Fundamentally, what we've seen in the past with technological development is that many of these somewhat immoral things that happen evolve to seem better. If you look towards baby stem cells, that was something that existed at one point, and it eventually evolved to something like bone marrow stem cells, which was a technological innovation that came as a result of a very controversial policy. And we can see that this creates a potential pathway to new technology, so we may not even be stuck with these siblings forever. Yeah.
Okay, so the thesis of your case is based on protecting minorities, but these savior children are also minorities. Why do the lives of these savior children not matter?
Okay, so fundamentally, uniquely what we have to see is that in the issue of mixed-race couples, there are genetic markers that make people compatible or not compatible for donations. Fundamentally, if you are dealing with couples where one is in one way, one is the other, neither parent individually is a suitable donor, but the child is potentially a suitable donor. And we believe that insofar as the front half modeled out death, we believe that we're very justified in saying that this second child isn't going to be substantially harmed by, say, donating some stem cells or something like that every once in a while. Now let's talk about the three main actors who are affected in this, as are three main themes of the debate. First, the children who are born as savior siblings, next the parents, and finally minorities. Now the first thing we have to see is that this, on our side of the house, directly benefits children. Why? Because we're normalizing having savior siblings to some extent and creating a concrete framework which leads to support system for savior siblings. Now side opposition brought up these things that children may have concerns later in life about how they were only born to help their sibling, but what we are providing for on our side of the house is a mechanism by which this can be normalized, creating support systems, therapists who specialize in helping these children, and other ways for there to be a legal precedent, rather than just whatever happens now where they might have been born to be a savior sibling, but we don't know. So the alternative is not having savior siblings. The alternative is people doing it anyway, but lying about why they had the kid, which we believe can cause problems down the line. Now let's talk about parents, who are the next important actor in this debate. Fundamentally, what we're doing is we are guaranteeing power and more autonomy to parents who are able to have children to do whatever they can to help their other child. Fundamentally, the medical system today, it can be expensive, it can be difficult to navigate, and we believe that it's really important for parents to be able to do something to save their kid, as they are fundamentally the first and most important person in their life.
So I don't think parents lying about having savior children is part of the debate necessarily. Debate in a world where these parents don't have that option.
Well, first off, I don't think that's realistic. I think people are doing it anyway, but even if we're talking about parents not having them anyway, we still believe that allowing for this pathwork, if it becomes something that's normalized, is going to become something that people have support systems for because it's something that happens all the time. Finally, let's talk about the minorities point, because something that we've seen overall is minorities, first off, have a harder time finding matches, and second off, are disproportionately more likely to not be able to find an organ donor, to be put on dialysis for long periods of time, and all these other things. Fundamentally, what we are doing here is we are allowing for minorities to have another option and empowering a historically oppressed group, and we're reducing their dependence on expensive and inaccessible technology. Overall, what we have to see is that rich people are always going to have access to the newest technology and all of these medical innovations, but that isn't accessible to everyone. And we are allowing some of the most victimized members of society to do something to save their children. And what we believe is that parents have to do something to save their children. They believe they have to do something to save their children, and we on side government are providing a unique mechanism by which they are able to do something. So overall, what we today on side closing government show you uniquely is how minorities are among the most victimized and how we on our side uniquely help them as the specific actors in this case. Very proud to suppose.
I'd like to thank Governor Whip, and I would now call upon the opposition rep.
As this House, we are not passing policy for merely the voiceless. We are not passing policy merely for the savior child. We are not passing policy merely for the child who is ill. We are not passing policy merely for the individual family. We are passing policy for a society, for a country, and for a world. This is the implication of our debate today, and this is something that has gone completely unaddressed and ignored by the entire debate round, other than closing opposition. And so what does this give you? What sort of world does this debate give you? That is what I would like to address in my speech today. As we close up this round, this is the implication on the world and the society at large, not just merely a limited group of constituents. So what is the implication under their world? Well, under their world, we see a value of pragmatism, a value of using people as a means to an end. A means to an end of someone else's life, a means to an end sometimes at the detriment of their own survival or their own quality of life. This is what we see. And they say that yes, this might be true merely when they're young, this might be true when they are infants, but then when they get older, then they can have the choice, then they can have the voice in this. However, I would like to point out one major flaw with this, one major flaw that we do not want in our world, and this is treating consent merely when it is convenient. This is using consent when it is convenient. And that is not something, that is not an implication that our world wants to get into. When we really view consent as something that is convenient to us, that yes, they can have a voice when they're older, but it doesn't matter when they're young. That is not the type of world that we want to live in. Because what are the implications of that on the world at large? What is the implication on the society? Well, exactly what Gabe brought up in his speech. How in China they can take these organs from prisoners and give them to other people. This is using consent merely as a tool for our own ends. And that is not something that we as closing opposition, not us as opposition at all, tend to agree with. Because we think that there is something moral, there is something inherent in each person that gives them the ability, the right to have a voice. And they are taking this voice from the voiceless and treating it as something that they can give and take away whenever they choose. This is the values of the world on their side. This is the values of side government. But what is the implication of this on the system at large? What's the implication not just simply on these individual families, these individuals? The implication is that the system gets worse and the system harms more people. Now how is that? Well, we've seen this spiral of philosophy, how this can spiral out of control and create a lot of problems. But specifically within the healthcare system, it reduces advancement. It reduces advancement very practically and very measurably. Now why is this? Well, when you have simple stem cell research that's going on, but then you tell people, no, it's okay, we have Save Your Siblings, you can forget about that, you don't have to work on these solutions, we have these options now. It limits and reduces the incentive for people to do this. Furthermore, a point that Gabe addressed is it limits the incentive for donors to actually want to donate their organs. And so what's the implication of this then? We have a smaller base. We have a smaller base of donors. We have a smaller base of people who are willing to donate, yes, to minorities as well as the community at large. We are impacting the entire community here. Because see, not everyone even has access to these Save Your Siblings. Not everybody has access to them because not everybody is a young child with both parents present in their lives. That is a very marginalized group, sadly, in our world today. For the entire adult base of sick people, they do not have access to this. And the adult basis of sick people will also be harmed because their donor pool will now be diminished. The cures to their diseases will now not be happening. And so it's impacting these people in a very measurable way. But you don't think that matters.
Okay, so currently do you agree that just because we find one cure for cancer, that doesn't necessarily mean we stop looking for other cures, right? Doesn't this apply to this situation as well?
Absolutely. We can find cures for cancer. We can find cures for all of these diseases. But what restricts the ability to find these things is when people don't have the incentive. And having these Save Your Siblings is removing the incentive from the current system. It's removing the incentive for the other people who don't necessarily have access to this very niche solution. Now, yes, they brought up the point of minorities and said that how minorities, this is a unique thing that they can have to them. However, if we have a broader base of donors, if we have a broader base of people who are willing to donate because they don't think this niche option will work for everyone, if we have that broader base, then yes, these minorities will have the ability to have more donors. Now let's talk about what you get, however, in our world. Let's talk about what side opposition brings to the table. And it actually brings an incredibly measurable benefit to the system and to the world of ethics itself. Now it talks about a consistent worldview. A consistent worldview in the essence that we are valuing the voiceless. We are valuing these children not just simply from when they're 10 years old, when they're 15 years old. We're valuing them from the start. We're valuing children when they don't have a voice. And so we're giving them the ability to have a high quality of life, not just simply for the sake of someone else, not just simply for the sake of their sibling, not just simply for the sake of their family, but for their personal autonomy, for their personal value. We are treating people with the dignity that they deserve so that yes, if when they're 15, if when they're 18 or 21, later on in life, they want to donate, they are able to donate. They are able to help this system. However, we are not taking away that fundamental choice in the very existence of their lives. We're not taking that away from individuals as we are outside government. And so what's the implication of this on the system then? Well, the implication is advancement. It's innovation. We have people coming into the system with the true motivations, which are pure motivations, of wanting to help others, of wanting to bring others up, and wanting to help advance the medical system. Now, I'd like to take the remainder of my time now to address essentially the debate as a whole and show you how closing opposition essentially comes out on top. Now, I'd like to do this one by one. We have the side of opening government. Opening government talks about this idea of essentially what is an inconsistent worldview. An inconsistent worldview in saying that yes, we value the good of society, yes, we value these advancements, yes, we value individuals, but not the individuals who are voiceless. We don't value the individuals who are voiceless, and as a result of this, they value societal good when it is convenient to them. Now let's talk about closing government. Closing government has a very limited option of that in minorities. They say, yes, we're helping minorities, we are helping these individual people. However, that is a very niche environment, a very niche one that doesn't necessarily help the entire community at large. And yes, it is important to help minorities, and that's something that we've discussed can also be taken into account by our broader base of donors. Now let's talk about that aside of opening opposition. Yes, opening opposition gave you a lot of really great arguments. I would tend to agree with them on a lot of things. However, there is a unique extension that comes from closing opposition. And closing opposition refocuses this entire debate to what it should truly be about, the absolute purpose of this House. Not just simply focusing on limited groups, not just simply focusing on the debate at hand, but how this policy impacts the entire community, the entire globe, how it impacts our values, how it impacts our community. And it is for this reason that we firmly oppose the resolution.